Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 41 of Riskology by Infortal. It's been a wild ride, as everyone I'm sure is well aware at the moment, in terms of change and significant geopolitical impacts in 2025. A lot of executive orders that have been getting the attention in the headlines, both here in DC where I'm at, but I think even across the country. I don't know, is it even getting covered in California, Ian?
It totally is getting covered in California. We started the new year with a bang, with fires, and immediately catapulted ourselves into political turmoil.
That's right.
And yeah, 2025 is off to the races at the speed of Trump.
Yeah, there's so much to cover with the new administration, so many executive orders just to begin with. We thought today we would actually hone in on one of those executive orders that hasn't gotten quite as much coverage, but I think will soon come to the forefront and really will create some interesting debate and at least some interesting dialogue regarding how this might play out. And that the executive order itself is called Designating Cartels and Other Organizations as Foreign Terrorist Organizations and Specially Designated Global Terrorists. Definitely a mouthful just to get through the title itself. But in simple terms, basically, the U.S. government is planning to take a look at the cartels based out of Mexico operating, across the border here in the United States as well, and considering classifying those organizations as terrorist organizations. Granted, the threat is already there in terms of doing business with a potential criminal organization and exposure to money laundering. But once you cross the threshold and start talking about foreign terrorist organizations, the magnitude changes and the dynamics can change both from a regulatory standpoint and a criminal standpoint. All of us can probably agree that there's a lot of similarities between some of the characteristics of what we would think of as a terrorist organization and the cartels themselves. But I think there is some nuance and differences here. And I know you've looked closely at that, Ian. So looking forward to sort of getting your perspective there. But again, this one really does invoke a lot of different regulatory and criminal dynamics that companies may be faced with in the near future.
Yeah, it's significant just from the security aspect of itself in that terrorist groups are more like nonprofits. There's no market demand for suicide bombers connected to ISIS to do what they do. It operates more like a charity. It's got a political goal that people who support it want to achieve, and they donate their time and resources to doing it. But the drug cartels and, the mafia and any sort of criminal organization that runs businesses, whether they're legal or illegal, and in many cases it's a combination of both, they're business oriented. So you're not really fighting an ideology, you're fighting a market demand. A second problem, specifically with this in Mexico and also in the US, in that because the cartels are so pervasive, they touch different industries that even are not illegal. You have bribery issues in Mexico. You have things like that, where because of the way that they're positioned in Mexico's economy, even though they're criminal organizations, it poses a risk for ordinary businesses doing business in Mexico, and it opens them up to sanction. It opens them up to prosecution.
Yeah, the fallout from this would be significant. I'm just looking at the executive order now, and there was a timeline that was placed on the order of providing a couple of weeks, 14 days, for really the secretaries of a lot of different agencies to consult over this issue. The Secretary of Homeland Security, Director of National Intelligence, the Attorney General, to sort of look over the potential for classifying the cartels in Mexico as terrorist organizations under 8 U.S.C. 1189. Once these cartels are classified as terrorist organizations, it really invokes a lot of potential law enforcement and regulatory enforcement issues that could impact banks, could impact suppliers, can impact businesses here.
A while back, we put a piece up on our website about conflict guac, right? Everyone's sort of familiar with conflict diamonds, but the Super Bowl is coming up. If you're having guacamole in the US, for example, there's a very good chance that the avocados used to make that guacamole come from Mexico, which is about where 80% of the avocados come from. The rest come from the Southwest, California, Arizona to a lesser degree. But the cartels are heavily involved in the avocado industry in Mexico. Now, you're going to think, well, if I'm a business and I'm importing avocados, what does that have to do with me? Well, it does, in the fact that if you're doing business with one of those cartels, technically, according to U.S. law now, you're doing business with a terrorist organization. Even though with the activity and the substance in question, avocados, they're not obviously illicit substances. The business transaction, those relationships are still there. So by designating the cartels as terrorist organizations, it opens up a very broad pathway for companies to actually find themselves under the microscope for financing terrorism, even though current risk officers, compliance officers would never, ever think that that was the case.
Yeah, that's a good example there, because the cartels, as we know, are not just dealing in drugs. They're not just dealing in human trafficking, but seemingly legitimate industries are basically wholly dependent on certain cartels. You know, you've got mining, transportation, agriculture, as you mentioned, but even basic services like high-speed internet could be completely controlled by the cartel in certain industries. And so if you're providing support to companies that are caught up in that web, now the stakes will be raised, because you cannot be seen under the crosshairs of providing material support to a terrorist organization, both from a reputational standpoint, but also from a criminal standpoint, and potentially having assets frozen. And so what does that mean? That means that anything that has any type of a nexus to the border, or things that have originated from certain areas of Mexico, will require a lot more scrutiny and a lot more due diligence to truly understand who you're doing business with. And so, yes, the financial institutions have a lot of mechanisms in place. And so it could be a case of expanding the scope of the types of enhanced due diligence that they're doing. But what we've got a problem with here, and where it gets complex, is the fact that the cartel, because they're essentially laundering money to begin with, it's very difficult to find ties between the cartel and different businesses as it is. And so companies are going to be dealing with a much more challenging situation. The magnitude of this decision is a lot larger than just going after the cartel criminal element itself. There has been proposed legislation of coming up with a unique classification to avoid some of this fallout. That could be a potential solution. I think the challenges there are, once you turn to Capitol Hill, it's tough to get new and innovative legislation out there. There might be a possible window with the reconciliation bill and a lot of the negotiations with the upcoming budget renewal. I don't know. I also kind of think that the 14-day window is very ambitious. We're already past it. So I think there's going to be some careful examination that even goes into this before a path is mapped out. That's sort of my thought.
Going back to what I was saying before, you have this sort of dynamic with the cartels that enables the cartels to be as pervasive and powerful as they are, is the combination of the U.S. demand for illicit substances, primarily drugs, but also human trafficking to a lesser degree and other things. And then the ability that gives the cartels to facilitate corruption in Mexico. And that's the battery for all of the criminal activities in a nutshell. And just going after the cartels, it's not going to tackle it unless you actually go after the market and then also the corruption. To add another layer to this, because of corruption, normal vetting procedures are probably not going to work, especially if you're relying on something like a dashboard to do it. It's not going to be readily apparent that your avocado provider is going to be connected to a cartel.
Yeah, I agree. Look, we don't know whether or not this will go through and how it will ultimately look in terms of potential legislation or classifications, but there is enough information out there now for organizations, particularly for banks, to kind of take a look at the customer profiles to see where you might need to start making some changes into how you approach things. For companies that are outside of the financial sphere, they're heavily regulated in terms of having to deal with the Bank Secrecy Act. But if you're in a position where, let's say you're in real estate or you're managing supply chain logistics, things like that, and you have key concentrations of customers, you should really take a closer look of, let's say this classification comes into play. How could that impact my customer base, my suppliers, sort of the people that I'm doing business with? And do I have any heightened risk? Now, I think it could be easy to take a step back and say, hey, look, you should be doing that already. You shouldn't be doing business with the cartel to begin with. But once the stakes are raised, once this classification comes into place, typically you'll see the full might and teeth of the law enforcement organizations going after situations in ways that they haven't before. And so your potential exposure to falling into some sort of a regulatory action or even criminal situation gets even more pronounced. And I think one of the key problems that we've seen where people have run afoul of this in the past is the reputational damage, because you do not want to be included in any type of a search that includes providing material support to a terrorist organization. That's definitely a deal breaker. So it's been a wild ride so far in 2025. That is probably going to continue in the coming weeks. So we'll look out and see what happens with this particular issue, but I'm sure we'll have plenty to cover as we move forward.
Thanks for joining us.